Welcome to Ponchatoula Live, the show where we make it easy for you to connect with the people of Ponchatoula. I'm your host, Parker Layrisson, and today I've got a truly fantastic guest. It's not often that I get to interview one of my lifelong heroes, but I get that privilege today with this discussion with Judge Jimmy Kuhn. Now, if you have lived in Ponchatoula for any period of time, you probably already know Judge Kuhn or know of Judge Kuhn. He is a true local legend. This man is a titan in my industry, the law. Long before I became an attorney or set up shop here in downtown Ponchatoula, he was winning cases in court as a famed trial lawyer, then a district judge in Amite, and ultimately he got promoted to the First Circuit Court of Appeals in Baton Rouge, and he served over there for decades with distinction. He's a fine man, but he's also got a really interesting life story. Growing up with hardscrabble roots here in downtown Ponchatoula, one of 9 kids, just a great self-made man who's done many things well. And I can't wait to introduce you to Judge Jimmy Kuhn. So with no further ado, Judge, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you, Parker. That was quite flattering. I don't know about the
I could have gone on and on. That was 1/100th of the accolades I could have thrown at you. Why don't we begin our show with you just telling us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. As the old saying goes in Ponchatoula, I'm from Ponchatoula because I went to the first grade here. I was actually born in Hammond. As you and I discussed, I'm number 8 of 9 siblings that my parents had. Right before, 2 weeks before school started in Ponchatoula, we moved from Hammond to our house on West Magnolia, and the rest, as they say, is history.
Now, that's the house on the corner of West Magnolia and South 7th Street where your brother Thomas now lives. Is that right?
That's right.
Yeah, and that's a big house in my life because my 2 little boys and I pass it all the time, pretty much every day. They love to go to the park at Kiwanis. We live on 8th Street, and it's on the way. So you typically will pass both Kuhn brothers, Thomas and you, en route to carpool at St. Joseph. Well, tell us about what it was like being the 8th of 9 Kuhn children there on the corner of Magnolia and 7th Street in Ponchatoula.
Well, that question's interesting because it shows you people can adapt to whatever circumstances they're confronted with. The house had 3 bedrooms. One bedroom was for the girls. One bedroom was for the boys, regardless of how many.
And give us a breakdown. How many girls, how many boys?
There were 3 girls and 6 boys.
Oh, wow.
At the time we moved, my oldest brother was already in the Air Force. And so there were only 5 of us really getting there. Shortly after that, my next oldest brother likewise joined the Air Force. But adjacent to our house, there was a garage, and my grandfather, my brothers, and I converted it to an apartment for them. So effectively, we had the 9 of us, my parents, and 2 grandparents there.
Wow.
But it was fascinating. It's an old house, and the original bathroom was a porch, and it was converted to a bathroom by the time we moved there. And what's fascinating or funny about that construction was that it was outside. So what you had to do in the wintertime was walk out of the kitchen door onto a porch and then into the bathroom. And that was exciting after you took a good hot bath in the winter.
Wow. That's got to be so hard for modern folks to imagine, right? I mean, we live with such luxuries these days. That's kind of unheard of, to walk through the heat or the cold, whatever you're facing every day. That's wild. Well, what did you learn growing up with modest means in a big family? What are some lessons you took away from that childhood and that experience that stick with you today?
Well, unfortunately, my mother had to work. So while she was at work, we came home from school, there was an unwritten rule that everyone did a chore and everyone participated in cooking a dish for dinner. And so the point there is, of course, cooperation. When you have that many people um, needing the same types of things. And, going back to the bathroom, the thought didn't occur to me. I don't know how we manage time-wise to schedule a bathroom, but I don't remember it ever being a problem.
That's impressive because I got to say, my little house only has one full bathroom. And we just have a small family, 2 small boys and a couple, but it seems really challenging to us in 2021 to manage the bathroom, and we've got nothing. I mean, you Kuhn sat it down to a science. That's nothing.
My mother was a great organizer and insisted on cooperation and combined work ethic. So it all worked.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned she worked. Tell us about her. Tell us her story. Was she local to the Ponchatoula Hammond area? What was her maiden name, her background, and tell us about each of your parents.
My mother's maiden name was McDaniel. She was from north part of Tangipahoa Parish. And I'm sure, Parker, you and quite a few people know McDaniel family.
Oh, yeah. Nick McDaniel's a good, great guy. Yeah, know tons of them.
My dad grew up in Washington Parish, and it's not that much difference. I frankly don't know how it is they met, given their family backgrounds.
Not much difference, except the watermelons are way tastier over there, right? We got the berries and they got the melons. Is that how it goes?
Right. Well, they were country people, and both of my parents had a third grade education. My dad used to like to read Western books, Zane Grey, paperback books. What's interesting about my mother, and I'll never forget it, she went to adult age. She worked, came home, made sure we all were doing what we needed to do, and then she would go to night class. When I was in the 7th grade, I watched my mother walk down the aisle and get her high school diploma.
That is so cool. Wow. Well, my mom, in a similar story, did not finish college when she started in the 1960s, but she went back to school at Southeastern when I was about that age. And it was similarly powerful for us as kids to be able to see mom. We saw it was tough times when she had to relearn calculus and she cried at the kitchen table because it was tougher than she expected. But man, when she got that degree, it was a really big deal. So kudos to your mom, man, to do that with 9 kids.
Yeah.
Wow, what a superwoman. That tells you so much of what you need to know about her. What about your father? What was he like?
Well,
But besides reading Westerns, I enjoy that because I've got a stack of Louis L'Amour books, a set that Miss Beauty Gildner gets, and my dad tries to steal them from me. I had to put him on a library system. There's a little card, and he can check them out at my house. But we love Westerns at the Layrisson house. So tell us more about your Western loving dad.
Well, he never really progressed beyond the 3rd grade. And so most of his jobs were, even though there was not a minimum wage at the time, his jobs were rather low paying. Primarily, I remember the Hayes family who used to live on Highway 22 had a milk plant here, and he worked at the milk plant and came to know a lot of dairy farmers. So I don't remember exactly where the plant was, but it was also, they had a plant here in Ponchatoula.
Mm-hmm. What about brothers and sisters? You have so many. You mentioned that you came along toward the end of the line there. What was the age range like? From you mentioned the oldest was already in the Air Force by the time y'all moved to Ponchatoula. Tell us a little bit about your siblings.
Yeah, my oldest brother passed away at 86. I think that was about 2 years ago. So there was somewhere between 12 and 15 years difference between my oldest brother and my youngest brother. That's an interesting point. My mother having so many children, best I could calculate, she went a minimum of 17 years straight with having at least one child in cloth diapers. Can you imagine?
Oh my goodness. Wow.
I don't know how a person does that, but she did it.
How she ever had time to go back to school with all the, because you mentioned not just in diapers, but in cloth diapers that you had to wash. And
Right.
oh my goodness, what a woman. Well, and here's a question. You mentioned you came over right around when school started. Do you remember who was your first buddy or your first best friend in Ponchatoula? Who were some of the kids that you remember from that early age that took you in and made you a friend?
Right. When we were very young, it would have been Larry Watts, Irwin Jenkins,
Oh, great
Scotty
guys.
McPhail,
Uh-huh.
and just people in the neighborhood, particularly those three guys. And of course, as we got into high school, more other people moved schools, changed schools, and
Sure.
yeah, a lot of people who went to Ponchatoula High School, of course, came from Champ Cooper, so they were new to us, if you will.
Right.
Grade. So,
Yeah, it's interesting to see that influx from Champ Cooper, because sometimes they're your buddies because you played baseball with them or basketball or something in the city leagues. But they had their own culture. I remember, Jared Gill, JJ Gill, as we called him, was one of my best friends, and I think I have an outstanding phone call from him from yesterday on my phone. But I remember when he and his crew came over, from Champ Cooper with their own kind of swagger, and in that case, these little group of guys maybe thinking they were going to run the school, and the little St. Joe nerds like me never presumed that we were going to rule the school. So we just kind of came in frightened and intimidated. But it's interesting to see the different feeders come together. And those men you mentioned are great. We had Mr. Irwin on the show a few weeks ago, and he told us some interesting stories, especially about the price of what things cost. Buying his first house for $100 or something like that, $100 a month, I think it was. It was really interesting. You mentioned Ponchatoula High. Tell us about your experience there. What I'd love to hear is if there are any teachers, coaches, anything, buddies, mentors, friends of any type. But tell us about what that experience was like for you, because Ponchatoula High is the connective tissue of this town, right? We're a one high school town. You may have gone to Champ Cooper or St. Joe or Ponchatoula Junior High, but we've only got one high school here. And it's always great to hear about the folks that went there, what it was like during that era.
Well, I'll tell you. Of course, I don't know the hiring process of what happened then, but there were a group of men, ladies too, but particularly men, who just demonstrated how a man ought to live his life. Like Herman McClendon, Milton Levine, J.D. Shield, Willard
Legends.
Butler. Willard Butler was principal until my senior year, and then A.J. Biker became principal. Buddy Biker, I mean, just wonderful men and great examples for how a man ought to live their life.
Amen. All great men. Well, this puts you at a unique crossroads to actually be at the transition of two of Ponchatoula High's greatest ever principals, two of the greatest educators in, Louisiana history, Mr. Butler, Mr. Bodker. What do you recall in similarities and differences? Tell us what it was like to be the student of two such legendary men.
First, I'll talk about A.J. Bodker. So before he was my principal, when I was playing football junior, became younger football, he was coach, and he just did it Marine style. Willard Butler was supportive of the team, but he was no foolishness type of person. So different people, and I know them in different ways.
Yeah, that's neat. Speaking of different people, we've got somebody chiming in here with a comment that I'd like to share with you, Judge. Tony Licciardi of Hammond fame. That's Tony Licciardi, who's the administrator of Hammond City Court. Dr. Tony Licciardi, the product of UNO. Great guy. He's a veteran of the Hammond City Council, where he, I think, retired once he was term limited. He says that Judge Kuhn is a great public servant and the life of the party. I couldn't agree more, Tony. Tony, thank you for chiming in, for sharing that with the judge.
Well, let me tell you an interesting story about his family, Tony's family.
Yeah, please do.
It's a small world. I met my wife Cheryl at Southeastern. She grew up first in the Irish Channel in New Orleans and then St. Bernard Parish. But she had a friend named Licciardi. Turns out that that's Tony's mother.
Oh, so, small world. Small
Cheryl
world.
knew Tony before he was Tony.
When he was little Anthony, maybe little Anthony down there.
Maybe, but she knew her before that.
Well, Tony's such a great guy. He's a dear friend of mine, and his wife Christy and my mother are close friends, and just great folks from a great family. And of course, his mom, of her own independent fame there from the school board down there in Jefferson Parish, was a heck of a public servant. She's now up here in Laranja, so it's kind of neat to see Licciardi's running around this area. You have to ask him about his both of his sons are very talented guys, but Gordon, the youngest, is now quite the hot musician over on the Mississippi scene. So it's fun to see that.
Like
Tony, we'll have to get you on the show sometime, Tony. Maybe you can tell us a little more about that. Folks, we're here with Judge Jimmy Kuhn, retired of the First Circuit Court of Appeals, as well as the 21st Judicial District. As I mentioned at the outset of the hour, he's been one of my heroes virtually my whole life, and certainly since I've been an attorney for roughly 20 years. He's telling us about his childhood, about his high school experience, and I think, Judge, you just gave us the beginning of the love story, meeting your wife at Southeastern. So tell us a little bit more. You told that in the context of the wonderful Licciardi family, but tell us about Miss Cheryl. How'd y'all meet? You've got such a great, successful love story. Tell us about how all that began.
Well, I consider myself one of, if not the luckiest people in the world, not only Cheryl, but because of a lot of circumstances. For example, we're very fortunate in Ponchatoula that we have Southeastern and Hammond. So, as I mentioned earlier, I think when you and I were talking, my parents never were fortunate enough to own a car. So my brothers and sisters, 5 of us graduated from Southeastern, could bum rides, hitchhike, do whatever we could get to Southeastern. And what's interesting too, Parker, I feel such a debt to Southeastern, but because of that and other things. For example, when I started Southeastern in 1964, the total registration and tuition was $37.50, and I had a $10 T.H. Harris scholarship. So my first 4 semesters cost me $27.50 a semester. The reason I say that's lucky, I'm lucky Southeastern was where it is.
Right.
And I was in Ponchatoula, and I'm lucky that tuition was that inexpensive, because without both of those, I think I may never have gone to college at all. So
you make such a great point there. It's the access financially and geographically that have really brought people out of poverty. And you mentioned, I think, 5 of the Kuhns in your house graduated from there. That's amazing. To come from a hard scrabble beginning with no car even to 5 college graduates. Here you sit, the veteran of all these courts and such an accomplished trial lawyer. And that's really amazing. And I share that love of the university with you. My mama, my wife, all the best women in my life went there. My brother Bree, my nephew's there now. It's a great university, and Tony went there too. I drew him all the way from the West Bank. So, well, tell us. Thank you for saying that. But let's circle back and let's talk about meeting your wife there. And what tell us about that, please.
Well, that's where I was leading. And talking about people. Right when I was starting school, Reggie Peavy was coaching every sport there.
Oh, what a
Coached all
legend.
my brothers and sisters at some point. But
Hmm.
anyway, so Cheryl and I were at Southeastern. There was a Woolworths in Hammond, and the way I worked my way through college was I was a janitor up at Woolworths in Hammond. Another fortunate thing. Let me drift and just tell you another story. So I had a job at Woolworths, and the manager came to me one day and said, "Jimmy, I hate to tell you this, but times are a little slow, so I'm going to have to lay you off." And of course, I was really worried then, but he followed it up. He said, "But I talked to the manager at TG&Y, and he's going to hire you." So next day I went to work at TG&Y. Same situation came up. He said, "Time's a little tough. I'm going to have to lay you off." But I talked to the manager at J.C. Penney's, and he's got a job for you. So I went there. And, it's just people looking out for me.
Yeah.
I wound up at Woolworths the last 2 years of college, and the women there used to kind of babysit me, if you will. They always watched, and if they decided I needed a pair of shoes, I know this sounds strange, but it's the truth, a pair of shoes, I'd have a new pair of shoes. If they thought I needed a new shirt or two, new shirts. But, it was just fortunate. But back to your question. So I was a junior and, real active in part of the social part of school. Unlike most kids in college, I was either in class or working. So Joel McWilliams lived across the street from us. Joel's now deceased. But anyway, Joel was dating and wound up marrying a girl from St. Bernard Parish. And he arranged for a blind date for Cheryl and I, and the rest is history, as they say. So,
Well, so you owe him that neighbor a deep a deep debt of gratitude.
I'll tell you another interesting thing about Joel McWilliams. And his mother was dear to Cheryl and I. As you know, when we moved back to Ponchatoula and live in the house we now, Virgil was our neighbor.
Right.
Just a beautiful, nice woman. But so Joel was real. He eventually died of complications of scleroderma, which is sort of like lupus. But he'd come see his mother real often when he was sick, and so he would come visit Cheryl and I after he saw his mother. But the three of us would talk, and Cheryl would leave to go to another room, and Joel would say, "You take good care of her, take good care of her," faithfully every time he came to our house. I hadn't thought about that in years, but it's a pleasant memory.
Well, it's neat to see that old house being restored to its former glory, and it's being renovated. And they look from the cheap seats walking by it every day, they seem to be doing a really good job with it. Jeff Daniels. Anyway, it's because that is kind of one of the marquee homes of town, right there in the corner by the park. And like you said, it's a great family that were the stewards of that home for so many years. So thank you for sharing that. That's neat. Well, you meet Miss Cheryl at Southeastern, blind date. What's the next chapter for you guys in this book of life?
The next chapter I went to in the National Guard to Fort Knox, Kentucky. When I came back, she was still in school. And in 1969, we got married. And this is another story of Providence taking care of Jimmy Kuhn. My brother Robert, it's a long story, but he drowned. And I decided before he drowned that I wanted to go to law school. So I scheduled a law school admissions test. But while we were searching for his body, I missed the law school admissions test. So I was working for an oil company in New Orleans, and my intention was to go to Loyola. So one day at lunch, I had a 45-minute lunch. And anyone familiar with New Orleans, I worked at Lee Circle, knows it's tough getting from Lee Circle to Loyola Law School and then back in 45 minutes.
Oh, yeah.
But I was going to take a chance, and being the country hick that I was, I thought the law school dean would just be sitting in his office waiting for me. So, as it turns out, the dean's secretary was Hap Lordy's wife, who I knew of because one of their daughters was attending Southeastern. It's a little bit younger than me, but I casually knew her anyway. So I asked if I could see the dean, and she asked why, and I told her I missed the test and class is starting in 2 weeks. Well, as fate would have it, he was in at lunch, and I still don't know how this happened other than the intervention of the Almighty. He actually agreed to talk to him. So I told him my reason I missed in a little more detail what we've talked about. He looked at my application and transcript and said, I'm going to let you in under 2 conditions. And that is that you don't ever tell anybody I did this because it would jeopardize our accreditation. And number 2, you take the law school admissions test.
Right. Cover your tracks, right? His tracks.
Right. So my last semester in law school, I took my law school admissions test.
Oh, that's funny.
And that guy's name is Marcel Garceau. He's an elderly gentleman.
Well, how'd you do? Did the test reveal that you should have been there, or did you slip through? The statute of limitations is run, Your Honor. You can tell the truth on it now.
Well, I never checked, to be honest.
You don't even know. That's funny.
So Cheryl and I were married, but right when I started law school, we got married. So she was teaching at Archbishop Shaw, and I was still working because it was quite expensive to go to Loyola.
Wait, so you couldn't do $27 a semester like you had at Southeastern?
No, several thousand.
No, wow.
But anyway, so we lived in Gretna. So each morning we had one car. She would drop me off at Lee Circle, drive back across the Mississippi River Bridge, pick me up at after work. I would drive back across the bridge, drop her off, then I would drive to Loyola Law School. Oh, this went on for a year, but as fate would have it, I got a little scholarship, so I didn't have to work anymore, and life was a lot easier for both of us. And I had some job offers in New Orleans and one in Plaquemine, Louisiana. And I took a job at Pittman and Matheny in Hammond. And I remember the interview. They said, okay, we want to offer you this job. And I said, okay, great, I'll take it. I wanted to get home so bad. I remember Tom Matheny said, well, Jimmy, don't you want to know what we're going to pay you before you accept it? I said, oh yeah, I forgot about that. Well, as fate would have it, I should have asked, but they taught me from day one. Day after I got sworn into practice law, I was in Franklinton by myself trying a case.
Whoa, straight into the courtroom.
Right.
Now, what kind of case was that? Was it civil? Was it criminal? I mean, that's really straight into the fire.
Years ago, in the Florida parishes, Pittman and Matheny and Hammond represented every insurance company, save for Travelers and Allstate. And I think this was State Farm. And it was a 2-car collision. But anyway, they insisted I know how to go to court. Taught me quickly.
That reminds me of when I went to work for my brother Jean Paul, fresh out of clerking in the federal court system. He didn't send me straight into a trial like they did you, but he sent me straight to a deposition on day one and said, "Here's the file, get at it." And at the time, it was really intimidating, but looking back, it was probably the best way to learn. You know, your knees were knocking, but you gave it your all, and you had to learn fast. Was that your experience, or what was it like?
Yeah, it was like that. And these two guys were like machines. They didn't believe in working past 5 o'clock. Pittman particularly, but he went to work at like 8 in the morning, and there was no letting up, not a moment's rest, if you will. But he likewise, both of them were in court because of the volume of their business. So they taught me how
Were
to
you the
work.
only associate attorney, or were there other young bucks running
No,
around trying cases for them?
at that time I was the only one.
Okay. Who would join that later? Did they add
Well,
associates while you were
yeah,
still there?
I think Alton Lewis, uh, uh, Marion Farmer was there before me. You know Marion.
Yeah. Wow.
Marion Farmer and Mike Cassidy, who was from Bogalusa. He wound up working for a bank there. Tom Waterman
Waterman,
was there after me, and
another legend. Yeah.
and
So that's really impressive. Future judges and bank presidents, and big shots of kind of all walks. That's a heck of a firm back in the day.
yes.
Well, let me ask you this. You mentioned the work ethic these two gentlemen had. Tell me about mentors in your life in the practice of law. It could, from law school to today. It's been my experience that to really, master your craft as an attorney, great mentors are a necessary element. Do you agree with that? Who are your mentors, and how's that work for you?
Absolutely, and in different ways, different people. Tom Matheny really taught me, and I'm not saying Mr. Pittman didn't as well, but Tom Matheny particularly taught me that in order for you to be privileged to have a license to practice law, you ought to be an honorable person, a truthful person, and when you say something, mean it, and mean what you say. But that sticks with me today without drifting off into any changes I've seen in the legal profession. But I'll tell you, another person was Judge Buddy Causey. And watching him deal with people my same experience and new people, he was just patient with new lawyers and trying to walk them through the court system. But I think the greatest help I got, believe it or not, were from the women who worked in the clerk's court's office.
I'm so glad you mentioned that, because that is one of the hidden secrets of practicing law, the importance of the clerk of court employees. And I feel like so many lawyers who are fresh off of the self-important ego trip that goes with passing the bar really neglect these folks and talk down to them or mistreat them. And these are the folks that have been doing it forever. And I had the great fortune to get to work a summer of college at the clerk's office and meet fine ladies that are still there. And when I was a baby lawyer, they saved my butt more times than I could count by pointing me in the right direction. So please expand on that, Judge, because you've really hit on a chord that I could not agree with more.
Well, always try to keep in mind, sometimes difficult, always try to keep in mind that it's always a lot of people that know a lot more than you know or what you think you know.
Amen.
I quickly learned that, as you say, these people who have extraordinary experience. So after filing a few lawsuits or filing pleadings that were wrong or procedurally incorrect, I developed a rapport with some of those ladies, and before I would file it, I would ask them to sit down and talk to me about it. I just didn't want to make a mistake, because my mistake impacts the people I represent. So I didn't want to hurt the people. And so we just, over the years, almost 20 years practicing law with the ladies that worked in the various clerk's offices, they understood that I appreciated if they helped me correct mistakes before it cost my clients. I'll tell you something, Parker. Well, as a judge, my very first jury trial, there was a lady who is now retired from the clerk's office, but I was just going through it, and so I was telling the lawyers, get prepared to make your opening statements. I was telling the jury what's going to happen, and this minute clerk kept waving at me, and I saw her waving, and so I said, after she waved 2 or 3 times, I said, I see, we're going to take a little break here in a minute for restroom for everybody. So she quit waving at me, and so I finished blabbing away, and I took a recess, and so I walk out of the courtroom, and they meet, and she was standing in the hall. I said, I thought you had to go to the restroom. She said, no, I was trying to tell you you haven't sworn the jury in, and you're telling them all this stuff, and you should have sworn them in first. But, you know, I decided you were going to do it your way. That was humbling. And so I also learned is that even though I've been practicing law 20 years, even though I was a judge, I had a lot to learn.
That's a neat story. Well, I'm really eager to hear about the judge years and your career on the bench. But before we get there, I want to talk a bit more about the years you practiced law. Because although I wasn't on the scene yet, I've heard from so many lawyers, including some that you mentioned, like Tom Waterman, our mutual friend who we just loved, that you were one heck of a trial lawyer, that you tried a ton of cases, you got tremendous results for your clients. So why don't you tell us a little bit about your years practicing law? You know, you mentioned about the beginnings, you know, Pittman Matheny. Tell us about the directions it took you in and just a little bit more about that.
Sure. I was with Pittman Matheny, they did transactional work too. So I had to, Dan Fowler was the abstractor for Pittman Matheny. He taught me how to do a title or research, but I really didn't like that at all. So I tried to steer away from that. And after practicing for about 3 years, Judge Bob Morrison, Calvin Fayard, and I went in partnership. And Bob was a transactional machine. I mean, he could type faster than I could talk. But he was great at that. And Fayard was involved with the business community. You know, we wound up representing a bank, but he had accumulated a lot of business clients. Our office was in Denham Springs, so we did a lot of business work. But I just either was preparing for or went to court every day. So of the 3 of us, I was the court person by and large, even though they both did go. And as fate would have it, I was asked if I wanted to be assistant DA, and I did that. My prosecution primarily was narcotics cases, but I wound up representing the Livingston Police Jury and various other public bodies. With the police jury, I went to the meetings, and occasionally there were suits, but the public bodies, my work with them was representing them in court. So my life was in the courtroom, and I loved it. I loved the competition of it, and that probably comes from my family background, but I loved the competition of it. And so much so, I found myself working 80 or 90 hours a week because the idea of missing a point and losing a case was intolerable. So I would work as hard on a $500 case as it was a $50,000 case. Custody cases were just heavy weight on my shoulder, but I, same thing with them. I just couldn't see where I perceived something might go wrong for the kids who were the subject of these divorce suits. So
Right.
anyway, I lived in the courtroom. We're getting ready to go.
So at what point did it occur to you to stay in the courtroom, but to jump onto the other side of the bench? When did the idea of running for judge take hold?
Well, that's an interesting story. It's a little bit long. I just want to go back to one day. I used to, when I would take a shower and wash my hair every morning, I would just leave it wet, comb it, and take off. So at this particular point in time, practicing law, I show up to office. My secretary was there early, and she said, one time, "What happened to your hair?" And I reached up to feel it. I had forgotten to rinse the shampoo out. So we went to the kitchen sink and she rinsed it out of my hair.
That's great.
So after this happened 3 or 4 times, me being so anxious to get my stuff and get to the courtroom, I decided I was going to use a blow dryer so I would remember to get the shampoo out of my hair. But to your question, it was one Sunday morning. Cheryl and I were in Denver Springs getting ready to go to Mass. And Rodney Cash, another dear friend of yours and mine,
yeah, great lawyer,
was knocking at my door in Denver Springs, and he had 1 or 2 other people with him. I can't remember if it was Chris Moody or not, but anyway, the purpose of the visit, they wanted me to run for judge. Judge Leon Ford was retiring, and they wanted me to run for a seat. And I told him, as you well know, you must be crazy. Cheryl and I have 2 adopted kids. I'm going to take care of my kids, and I'm not going to cut my pay as bad as it was.
Yeah, because you were doing really well at that time. That'd be a big pay cut.
Yeah, enormous pay cut. And I said, no, I'm just not going to do it. And Rodney said, would you please think about it? And so, about 2 weeks later, I'm sitting in our living room in Denham Springs with boxes of files on each side of me. And my kids came to say good night and give me a kiss, while Cheryl had been watching television with them and reading books to them. I was there with piles of files, and I said, well, I'm making a lot of money, but what kind of quality of life? And frankly, the intellectual part of being a judge is attracted to anyone who really likes the law or likes the history of the law and so forth. So I decided to run. I qualified the last day, and at that time they had 6 other people who had qualified. So
wow, so you won in a field of 7 candidates. What was the election like? This was your first time running for office, right?
Well, much to everybody's credit, and this is a fading away instance most of the time now in judgeships, it was all about who's best qualified. So it was easy. There wasn't any personal attacks or made up stories, which I was to encounter later, particularly in the Supreme Court race. But it was pleasant. There were debates, public appearances, and you actually had to talk to people and ask them to vote for you. And if you're not humble enough to do that, then you're not going to be successful running for any office. But I enjoyed it, and I enjoyed being on the district bench.
So this is a race for district bench, which the 21st Judicial District is Tangipahoa, Livingston, and St. Helena parishes, right? So you campaign in all three. Obviously, we've been talking about your history as a native of Ponchatoula, but at this time you're running, were you still living in Denham Springs, or were you back home yet here? Where
No,
were you?
I was in Denham Springs, and
Okay.
I felt comfortable about running. One reason is the people in Denham Springs, particularly the people I wound up representing, of course, were very helpful. They um, occasionally some business that we might be representing saying, were you interested in doing this for somebody? And so the people in Livingston Parish were very welcoming and helpful to us. And of course, my mother was still alive and in Ponchatoula, and we were back over here fairly often, so I felt comfortable about it.
Mm-hmm. Well, you mentioned you enjoyed the district bench. Tell us a little bit about things you liked, being a judge versus your career as a practicing attorney, and maybe some things you missed from the practice of law. How did the two careers compare?
Right. Well, Parker, you are a lawyer that goes to court. Um, it's hard for people, I think, people not in the profession to understand that trying a case is art. It
Right.
involves you being able to express yourself, to think quickly on your feet, no procedural laws right off the top of your head, no evidence laws off the top of your head. And so it's not being the smartest person in law school, but the person who can express himself, think quickly, and relate to people, whether it be the judge or the jury. And there's not many people that have that grasp. There are quite a few people who are practicing law who just are fearful of going to court. So
Right.
it's a unique, small group of people who enjoy it and recognize that it's a work of art.
I'm so glad to hear you describe it that way. And I think you've done a great job of focusing on how important preparation is. My mentor, who was my trial advocacy professor, Ed Walters, who you know well is one of the great legends of the state, he would always tell us that preparation beats talent 99 times. Out of 100. It's so important to know your case. So to hear these tales of you bringing home boxes of files, having them there at the dinner table, that's tough. It's a challenge to quality of life. And you made a good point there about, the price you paid as your kids go to bed giving you kisses. But if you don't do that and know your case better than every other lawyer in the room, it's really tough to win. Would you agree or disagree with that?
I absolutely agree. And I think lawyers' most important role in their profession in life in dealing with the people they represent is to be a helper first and foremost. They ought to be helping people.
Great
Secondly,
point.
is to counsel them, CONSUL, and that not only involves legal aspects but life aspects too, because some people want to fight over principle, and that's good. Many times it's necessary, but occasionally it winds up causing more damage to your client than what they could recognize. So lawyers should be helpers first and foremost, and should give counsel secondly.
That's a great point. So little attention is paid to the counselor role in the media, and especially in TV and the movies. I mean, everybody, when they hire a lawyer, they seem to want a gladiator to go fight, and but they only show the trials and the high drama stuff on TV. Sometimes the best advice is it's not worth paying me or any other attorney $300 an hour to go fight over this. Your best move is to make peace. And I'm so glad you've shared that wisdom of lawyers' role as counselors and how our hearts should be as helpers. We may not be public servants, but as officers of the courts, we can be private servants to the public by helping them with great advocacy, but also great advice. So how did you take that helper's mentality, that servant's heart, and put it to use on the bench? What do you feel like were some of the best aspects of what you did as a judge?
Well, I started off exclusively doing domestic cases in 3 parishes and juvenile cases. And so, as you know, in the system, the DA's office is initially involved in juvenile cases.
Right.
Well, my senior high school football coach was Elton Shaw. The man was a genius, like my mother, in dealing with kids. He could make you feel half an inch tall by calmly talking to you and telling you what you've done is so wrong. So the DA's office, at my request, hired Elton Shaw to deal with the juvenile cases. And by the time I got to him, Coach Shaw had worked with him, given him advice, and most of the time, in his way, the kids saw that he was right about it. Occasionally it wasn't, but that was also burdensome because I saw so many kids who, if they just had a little break like I had in my life, then they wouldn't even be in the courtroom. But I had a lot of people around me, and let's go back to growing up here in Ponchatoula. Like Carl and Ed Bayham coached me baseball, and Spike Reagan and his son, and Dennis Abear, Buddy Dufresh.
I've got photos of about half of those legends that you mentioned on my walls. And Coach Bayham was my coach at St. Joe too. He helped Coach Berner. Yeah, great men. Thanks for mentioning them.
I'll mention this too for Buddy Dufresh. When I was 11, I was a big kid. I weighed 165 and 5'9". So I got to play in the Little League and the Pony League simultaneously, which was great. And so it's an all-star team, and we were going to Mississippi to play in a tournament, all-star tournament. And so after the last practice, Spike Reagan said, okay, tell your parents you need to bring X dollars when we leave to go on this trip to help pay for your food and so on. So after practice, I tell him, Mr. Spike, I can't make it. And Buddy Dufresh happened to be standing there. He said, I'm paying your way, don't worry about it. So the first time, 11 years old, I set foot out of the state of Louisiana, was on a baseball team. And of all places we went was Clarksdale, Mississippi. I don't know if you've been there, but it's not the garden spot of Mississippi.
I have not been there. I haven't even heard of it.
Right. Well, anyway, another thing I won't forget. People in town were aware of who everyone was and how everyone lived. And so that man, the Dufresh family, paid for my first trip out of state.
Mr. Buddy's such a legend. I mean, he was a mentor to my dad too. Dad has so many stories of his generosity, not just with his money, but his time, his energy, his attention. There's just so many people in Ponchatoula that were impacted by him. And it's great to see his family carry that out in the next generation. I mean, heck, he's got, there's so many Dufreshes that have been so prominent, and, some as elected officials and others in other spots, but it's just such a great family. I love this story.
I like your family, just decent people, Parker. But you asked me about judgeship, and then when I gravitated to general jurisdiction, my joy was seeing good lawyers try good cases, and my only concern from being in the courtroom was watching lawyers who might be harming their client because they were trying to do things they weren't really prepared to do.
Right.
Representation. So for an example, right at the end of my law practice, a good client came in and said, I want some help drawing a will and some estate planning. I said, you're in the wrong office. So I had the good sense enough to locate him some. You know, it was great watching people that were prepared and knew what they were doing and enjoyed being in the courtroom. And, you know, the sad part about it was just human nature caused you to have empathy for both sides in the case. And,
Sure.
you know, all sorts of tragic cases, all sorts of cases with happy outcomes and so forth. But
yeah.
It was fascinating dealing with people, watching people.
Yeah. Well, we've only got 4 or 5 minutes left here, unfortunately, because I could sit here and listen to you for hours, and maybe we'll get the opportunity, or your schedule will allow for us to bring you back another time and talk more. But with these last few minutes, what would you like to share with the people watching? Is there anything on your mind, on your heart, just anything at all you love to share with our viewers?
Yeah. Um, I want to talk about my brothers and sisters.
Yeah, please do.
So, and how, and people who know our family know this is true, how smart my mother was and how she instilled good work ethic and some ambition. My oldest brother, Percy, after the Air Force, went to engineering school. He graduated in electrical engineering. He worked on weapons systems for nuclear submarines. And at the time of his death, he had worked in some form or to some extent on every nuclear submarine in the United States Navy. He also had great work ethic. He had 4 different retirements and worked till he was 81.
Wow.
My sister Myra was a supervisor and worker at Bell Telephone. My brother Thomas, who you know well.
That was my dad's wide receiver. I've been hearing about Thomas Kuhn catching Eddie Layrisson football passes my whole life.
Well, Eddie and him have some interesting stories. Thomas was blind in one eye, yet he played basketball and ran track, but he became a coach and school administrator. My brother Albert had a math degree, and he went to work in the space program. His team was slide rules. This is before computers calculated the trajectory to and from the moon. He led the team using slide rules to do that. Then after that, he worked on ballistic missiles. He didn't like that, but he wound up working with the lunar rover on that, and also the space shuttle. And he's retired as a vice president at IBM. My sister Catherine was a human resource director for an engineering firm, and she is, of course, retired now. My youngest brother, Marion Paul, some people call him Paul, I call him Marion, retired as a pharmacist at Walgreens in Hammond. So I'm just proud of my family, but I believe all
of course you are. That's remarkable.
I would agree my mother was the impetus for all of that.
What a wonderful woman. And I'm sure she's smiling down from heaven, watching you give this interview, just sharing, your pride in your family, because it is one of the great families of Ponchatoula. And you are certainly a really big part of that. And what I love about it is there's such a great element of homecoming in your story, right? Your brother Thomas living now in your old family homestead, but he went off to make his mark, and like you said, he was an administrator. He was in other parishes. He was all over. You guys have traveled all over. And you could live anywhere in the world, Judge. I mean, you did so well in your private practice. You could probably be looking out at the Pacific in Carmel if you wanted, but you chose to come back to Ponchatoula and live a block away from the place where you grew up, where the bathroom was in the back porch. and that's really a neat story. And I think it encapsulates so much of what is magical about this little town. You know, we could live anywhere in the world, but we choose Ponchatoula because of its people. And I think you hit that nail on the head. And there are no better people in the town of Ponchatoula than the Kuhn family, and especially Judge Jimmy Kuhn. So, Judge, many thanks for doing this show. I know how busy you are. I know how important you are, and your time is very valuable. So I thank you for spending this hour with us. To our viewers, thank you for tuning in. We'll be back here next week, same time, same place. So thank you all for watching Ponchatoula Live. Take care.